COMIRB. Maybe you can just
Sure.
do a brief introduction.
You want Allison to start
Recording? Yes, Allison, please record.
Got it.
All right, excellent. So my name is John Heldens. I'm the director of COMIRB. I've been here just over 2 years now. Prior to that, I was doing consulting work in IRB areas, and prior to that, I was at UC San Francisco, where I was there for 5 years. I was with that IRB for 24 years total. So I've been doing IRB stuff for going on 29 years now. It's not too long. I do enjoy it. It's still new things to figure out and to help researchers with, and this is one of them. So I'm glad to be here. And I like to say when I'm meeting with researchers, thank you. I really appreciate the work that you do. The IRB, I understand, is a hard part, but it's just one part of actually completing a study, and you get to do all the rest of it, and we just see this one slice. And so, and I've been doing this long enough to know how easy it was with the IRB 30 years ago compared to how it is now, and that grows. So thank you. How many of you do research with adults, and how many with children? So that distinction is going to come into play later in this presentation, and I want to spend some time talking about some specific changes that I think apply to the research that you do. And Jen, thank you for sort of pointing that out to me. So the 2018 requirements, they're finally here. As you may or may not know, they were delayed. Oops, wrong one. So today I'm going to go over some of the key changes in the 2018 requirements, explain to you how we have handled compliance issues at COMIRB, and point out some key points for you. The key points that we're going to discuss here are a little different than the key points I discussed at the town hall. We are live, so the new rule is in effect as of Monday, so no more delays. Quick timeline of history. This was published back in January of 2017, intended to go live, if you will, on January 19th, 2018. It was delayed 6 months, then delayed another 6 months, and now we're here. That final delay allowed some institutions to implement 3 burden-reducing provisions that helped us sort of start to streamline and start to transition research to the new regulations. We could start doing that July of 2017. As I mentioned, the compliance date was this past Monday. There is another regulatory change that won't come into effect until next year, and that has to do with single IRB review. I won't talk about that much today. I will say that we started taking advantage of the burden reducing provisions in July. We were one of the few institutions that did so. I can't exactly explain why that is, except perhaps resistance to change. So our overall strategy for this transition, but it reflects my business strategy as much, is to keep the regulatory pieces as much internal to COMIRB, so they're as visible as possible to you. Ideally, I like the researcher to tell us what you're doing, and we will give it the right level of review. So we're not there yet in terms of implementation, but we published a secondary research application this summer, and it certainly had that strategy in mind. Didn't ask you to select exempt or expedited or not human subjects. It was just, are you doing secondary research at this existing data? Tell us more about that, and we will review it as it needs to be reviewed, so you don't have to think about the level of review. It helps us, minimizes the amount of education and outreach we need to do. I just can educate my staff and make sure our chairs are educated as well. Quick note on terminology. Originally, this was referred to as the new rule or the final rule. Now it's referred to as the 2018 requirements because that was the original compliance date. And that's what the federal government is referring to it as, and that's what I'm trying to do as well. And the implication, of course, is that the old regulations are the pre-2018 requirements. The new requirements apply to all research involving human subjects, supported or otherwise subject to regulation by any federal department or agency. We will apply the requirements as broadly as possible. That is, we will apply it to non-federally funded research as well. We can deal with different sets of regulations as part of our job, but this is bigger than most, and so we'd prefer not to have one set of regulations for federal, one set of policies for federal regulations, federally funded research, and one set of policies for non-federally funded research. If you submit a new study today, the new rules are going to apply. Every new study we review from this point forward falls under the 2018 requirements. If you submitted us a study last week and we haven't approved it yet, when you submit your response and we do approve it, it has to comply with the 2018 requirements. If your study was approved under 2018 requirements, it can spend the rest of its life under pre-2018 requirements unless we specifically transition it. So quick quiz. COMIRB's reviewing a clinical trial. We reviewed it on the 16th at our panel D meeting last week, but we issued some minor mods. And the investigator submits his or her response yesterday. Now we can approve it. Which set of regulations apply? 2018 regulations. So that means in COMIRB we had to make some additional changes to the consent form, which I will speak about later. The key changes for the 2018 requirements, and this is sort of a summary. A new definition for human subject and new definitions for research, or rather definitions of activities that are not research. Changes in the requirements for continuing review, that's a popular change. Some new exempt categories, and those are, I think, are going to apply to you very much. So we'll spend some time talking about those, and maybe we can have a discussion of some examples. New consent form requirements, and a new requirement for broad consent. Are you accustomed to the term broad consent? Have you used that in your research before? If not, good. You don't need to think about it. Broad consent was the notion that, yes, you can use my biospecimens for any future research. Now it's been put under regulation, and in doing so, they've created some problems that make it difficult for an institution to be in full compliance with. So we are not implementing the broad consent provision at this time here. For what it's worth, I don't know of a single IRB that is implementing the broad consent provision because of the compliance problems it raises. So the new definition of a human subject, still a living individual about whom an investigator conducting research obtains information or biospecimens through intervention or interaction with the individual and uses, studies, or analyzes the information or biospecimens, or obtains, uses, studies, analyzes, or generates identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. So the takeaway here is this is really no different in interpretation from what we have always done, and every IRB has always done. What they did is they inserted the word biospecimens, but they still have to be identifiable. They also added, they elaborated on what you can do with these information or biospecimens. So they speak to obtaining or using or studying or analyzing or generating private information. All of those activities we would have considered human research, human subjects under the old regulation. So this isn't really an effective change. It's interesting to think that you might start with a de-identified data set and at the end of your research have an identifiable data set. That can happen. Do we want to mute anything? How do I do
Those
that?
who are on the phone Can you mute your line?
Thank you. Under the definitions of research, the new regulations specifically exclude a number of activities. I haven't listed them all here, but the first one, scholarly and journalistic activities, oral history, journalism, biography, literary criticism, legal research, historical scholarship. Those are not research activities by regulation. Most IRBs never considered them research activities in the first place. Some did. So I don't think this really changes anything here, but it might. Might for some of the work you do. I don't know if you do oral history sort of stuff, but the 2018 requirements no longer require an IRB to look at funding proposals. We are still going to do that. And we do that because it informs our review. So if you have a new NIH award, we're going to ask to see a copy. We do not make sure sort of go through line by line to make sure everything matches up. We understand that your proposal can change a bit, but it's helpful just to make sure that we were on the same page. The exciting change, continuing review is not required for expedited research or for any research that's progressed to the point that all that's left is data analysis and accessing follow-up clinical data from procedures that subjects would otherwise undergo. So this is one of the burden-reducing provisions we could start taking advantage of back in July. We have transitioned over 1,000 studies since that time. We've done the continuing review, or we've done an initial review, and they don't have an expiration date. Again, one of the few institutions that has actually done it. I know Northwestern has done it. Indiana University's done it. I don't know if anybody else that has implemented that. Now, a lot of institutions uncheck the box, which I won't explain, but it means that they can have some flexibility and issue 2- and 3-year approvals. So for those institutions, this would have been a less meaningful change. And I will talk more about our implementation strategy later in the talk. So there's a new exempt category, and there's some significant changes to some of the exempt categories. And this, I think, does affect you. So exempt category 1 has to do with educational research, and I've skipped over that. There's no real change in that category. Exempt category 2 had to do, this is survey, interview research. Formerly it was exempt as long as you didn't ask about any really sensitive information. As long as you didn't get into sex, drugs, and rock and roll, we could exempt it. Otherwise, we had to do an expedited review. The regulatory wording was, as long as subjects' responses do not reasonably place them at risk of criminal or civil liability or damaging to their financial studies, standing, employability, educational advancement, or reputation. They inserted the word educational advancement. Not a meaningful change. We always would have sort of considered that and moved it up to expedited if we needed to. Now there's paragraph C. Paragraph C says you can still collect the information and we can, with identifiers, and it can still be exempt as long as the investigator records the data in such a manner that their data are safe and secure, and the IRB conducts a limited IRB review and agrees that the data are safe and secure. So limited IRB review, that's a new term in the regulations. We formerly had full board review, expedited review, exempt review, and we can make non-human subjects determinations. Now we have a new limited IRB review. There are actually 2 types of limited IRB review. It's confusing. In this particular context, limited IRB review is referring to the regulation is 46.111A7. That has to do with privacy and data security. So if we look at the investigator's plan for privacy and data security and we agree it's sound, we can exempt the research. So you do qualitative research, you do focus groups, you do questionnaires and surveys. So what that means for your study, can you think of any studies that can now be exempted instead of expedited? The good news here, so in terms of our strategy, how do we ensure compliance with this? We already ask for you to tell us about your data security plans. We already evaluate those plans in terms of our review. So limited IRB review for COMIRB is just a subset of what we're already doing. It's very easy for us to operationalize this with our internal database, with our internal checklists, and our internal policies and procedures. So you don't really have to do anything differently than you always do. We just have a different way to document our review. What are the advantages of exempt versus expedited review? What is it? What else does that mean? Expedited review no longer gets a continuing review anymore. So the distinction between exempt and expedited is not as great as it used to be. We don't issue expiration dates for exempt research. That was another change we implemented. We used to have a 3-year approval period. So we're getting rid of expiration dates for expedited studies. We got rid of them for exempt as well. If you have an expedited study that no longer requires continuing review, you are still obligated to let us know about changes to approved research before you implement those changes. You're still obligated to report unanticipated problems, non-compliance, as always. You are still required to get consent. And that consent form, if it's signed and unless we've issued a special waiver, has to include all the required elements. So if you can exempt the research, you have flexibility in terms of what changes you need to report to us. The only changes you need to report are things that might make this non-exempt. You have flexibility in terms of your consent process. You don't have to meet all the required elements of consent. If you're conducting a survey or a focus group, we still expect you to tell subjects what you're doing, who you are, ask permission, but doesn't have to meet all the regulatory requirements of informed consent. So I think you'll find this is going to give you some flexibility, and as we move forward, we can explore those things with COMIRB. If you want to have further discussions, you have a particular study in mind, and see what you can and can't do, and maybe give yourself some flexibility. It makes it easier for you to get electronic consent, verbal consent. You have a lot more options if we can exempt this research. There's a brand new exempt category, number 4. Or 3. Anybody have questions about this? Exempt category, this is brand new. This is a category of research called benign behavioral interventions that can now be exempted. It used to be if you were actually doing anything with a person other than asking them questions or talking to them, it was automatically expedited. There was no exempt category for anything else. But now you can actually do a little behavioral intervention of sort. It has to be brief in duration, harmless, painless, obviously minimal risk, not physically invasive, not likely to have lasting impact on subjects, and the investigator has no reason to think subjects will find the interventions offensive or embarrassing. The examples and regulations are playing an online game, solving puzzles under various noise conditions, deciding how to allocate nominal amounts of cash between parties. So a lot of economic research sort of fits into this sort of this type of study. I skipped an important part on the last slide. Paragraph C here, adults only. If you're studying kids, this does not apply to you. So, benign behavioral interventions, again, adults only. Cannot do a benign behavioral intervention on a child. That has to be expedited. Subjects must agree. So we still, even though you don't have to meet all the informed consent requirements. Still an expectation that they're told this is voluntary. This is what we'd like you to do. Would you like to do it? There are some surprising limitations. So this may involve collection of information through verbal or written responses or audio-visual recording. There are other ways to collect data, and at the moment, that would seem to exclude the research from this category of research. So if you're collecting data, asking people to wear a monitor of some sort and collecting data from that monitor would appear to disqualify that research from this category. So there's, from a regulatory point of view, there's more work to do here. It seems to be, in fact, very narrow. Brief in duration, it's not defined in regulation, but one group that advises Office of Human Research Subject Protections in Washington has said it has to be like a matter of within an hour, certainly within a day. So studies in which you might send email reminders over months, but that's the only intervention, would seem not to be eligible for this. I think that's a little silly, but COMIRB is gonna explore this a little more, and in the absence of any other guidance, we have our own, and see if we can't fit more research under here. But for now, it's when you actually look at the details of particular studies, which we did, we didn't find many that actually qualified for this, but you may know of some going forward. And if you have one in mind, contact us and we can talk about it. Much like exempt category 2, if you collect data, it can be exempt if the data are not identifiable, or if there's no risk posed by the data, or if there is risk posed by the data, that is, it's sensitive information, we're back to the limited IRB review. We can still exempt it. The IRB agrees with your data security plan, data protection plans. Does this seem like any study that you are doing?
About niches, you know, the surveys and positions, yeah, which is already exempt, but. I'm also just thinking about the way in which we submit our protocols and roll everything up into one protocol.
Mm-hmm.
There are elements,
Oh, right.
Right. Where we're maybe doing a survey of parents. Then there's also maybe another aspect where there are children involved.
Right. Yeah, so in that case, we have to go with the highest level of review depending on what's all packaged in there, right?
It's really important to be provided with a parent. Child has to be present because it's really but we're doing delivery business. So we're not recording anything. At the end of it, we get a survey about the delivery visit, but not about anything that was discussed. It's just, you know, was the sound good? Was, you know, we just see each other over the visit, and, you know, was it something that you'd like to do in the future? Kind of thing. So, yeah, from that perspective, it's cool.
If all you're doing is surveying and interviews, then it's going to go back up to category 2. If it will, that's how we'll evaluate it. Is it applicable under category 2 or not? There are exclusions for children under category 2. There's some other things. If you observe that children, you can't participate in the interaction, for example. Yeah.
About the visit, you know, they're just having a conversation and stuff. They just want to know if it's something that's viable to be used in the future.
Mm-hmm. And with the exempt categories, it has to meet one of them. It doesn't have to meet all of them. Exempt category 4, this is the exempt category into which you're studying existing data. You get your data sets and you do some additional what we call secondary research now. So secondary research is a regulatory term now. So we're trying to just, for clarity, use the same terminology. As before, so in the old rule, in the pre-2018 requirements, we couldn't exempt it if you were recording identified if you recorded them temporarily just to get the rest of your data and then deleted the identifiers, we could still exempt it. But by and large, that was the cutoff line. If you recorded identifiers, had to be expedited. If you didn't, we could exempt it. That's changed. So now and it's changed for research that falls under HIPAA, which means it's changed for research where your existing data are medical record data. So if you are doing secondary research where you're asking us, I want to go to the medical records and I want to collect this, that, and the other, and I want to record names and medical record numbers so I can get some data elsewhere, we can exempt that now because under category C, because it falls under HIPAA. COMIRB's also the privacy board under HIPAA, so we're actually doing dual reviews when we review those activities. We're making an IRB determination and we're making privacy board determinations. So if, again, we have our secondary research application now. If you tell us you're going to medical records, just tell us what you're doing, what you're recording. We will give it the appropriate level of review. It's eligible for exemption under category 4. That's what we're going to do.
Doesn't matter if it's not.
Nope. Not in this case. Prisoners are excluded from the exempt categories if you are specifically studying prisoners. If you might just incidentally include a prisoner, which applies to a lot of chart review kind of situations. I want all patients of this type. There might be a prisoner in there. We don't really know. We don't have to worry about prisoners in that context. If it's not clear, I'm pitching the secondary research application form. Please use this if you're doing secondary research. I say that because we're still getting a lot of applications on our old form, and you're doing way too much work. This is streamlined specifically for secondary research. The questions are written to apply to, contextually to apply to the study that you're doing. And it's on our forms page. We are also working on a change to our main application form, but that's not ready yet. But right beneath that is the secondary research application form, and there's a link to an information sheet about it. A little more about broad consent. The purpose for broad consent is that it allows, there are 2 other exempt categories, number 7 and number 8. I didn't talk about those. We haven't implemented those. Those are not in our policies right now. The idea is if you have broad consent, then we could exempt additional research on biospecimens. The problem with broad consent, if we use the regulatory term, is that if you get broad consent, COMIRB is prohibited from approving any other future study with a waiver of consent for anybody who refused that broad consent. So that is the compliance issue. There's no way I can comply with that requirement. It obligates the researcher to record everybody who refused, and it obligates the institution to make sure that those refusers aren't included in future requests under a waiver of consent. So as the best example I have locally is the Center for Personalized Medicine. You may or may not be familiar with. They get consent for a blood sample through UC Health, through My Health Connection. They've enrolled over 80,000 subjects. There's probably close to 80,000 people who we have a record of refusing. If I were to consider that broad consent under the new regulations, those 80,000 we would have to exclude from all future medical record requests under a waiver of consent. So that would have a big implication. A detail you don't necessarily need to know: limited IRB review needs to be conducted by an IRB member. Internally, since I arrived, we have appointed some staff members as IRB members, so that's how we handle that. Chairs still do those reviews, but I also have additional staff who can do those reviews. All we need to do is, under this limited IRB reviews, assure that there are adequate provisions to protect the privacy of subjects and to maintain confidentiality of the data. The second type of limited IRB review I mentioned earlier has to do with broad consent. And that gets into evaluating what's in the broad consent form and also looking at confidentiality of data. But we're not doing that right now. I spoke to this already. It's already part of our assessment. So this was simply, a minor change we could do internally. No new responsibilities for you. Consent requirements. Any questions before I go on to this? I think your consent forms are pretty short.
We do a lot of the documentation.
Yeah. Okay. So this is probably not going to apply to much of your research. There is a new basic element of consent that will apply to your research. I'll talk about that in a moment. And there are several new additional elements of consent. Now, a basic element in consent and an additional element of consent, those are regulatory categories. And the regulations, when they talk about informed consent, they speak to the basic elements of consent, and those all need to be in every single consent form. And then they have additional elements of consent, which are supposed to be in consent forms when appropriate. Key information. Informed consent, this is the new regulation. Informed consent must begin with a concise and focused presentation of key information as most likely to assist a prospective subject or legally authorized representative to understand why they might or might not want to be in the study. This part of the consent form must be organized and presented in a way that facilitates comprehension. So the regulations now specify how the informed consent has to be organized. That's a big change. And the regulations don't provide any other guidance. When the regulations were issued, there were hundreds of pages of preamble, and within that preamble was some guidance information. So OHRP said their concise explanation would include the fact that consent is being sought, that participation is voluntary. It would include purposes of the research, expected duration of the prospective subject's participation, procedures to be followed, reasonably foreseeable risks, benefits to the subjects and to others, appropriate alternative medicine procedures. So that's an entire consent form. And when we first read that, we thought, what does that mean? This is supposed to be concise, and they just laid out what is in every consent form. But they go on and they say, as a general matter, a brief description would encompass key information. And they laid out their expectation is that key information is relatively short and would summarize information as is explained in greater detail later in the form. And they clarify that instead of needing to mention every reasonably foreseeable risk, key information would identify the most important risks. So then that leaves IRBs with the decision, what are the most important risks? Internally, we've operationalized that as the most serious and the most likely. And here they issued some helpful guidance, which is we recognize that for some relatively simple research studies with limited risks or benefits, the entire consent document may be relatively brief and still satisfy key information. That means if you have a short consent form, they're not going to be too worried about the format. We have operationalized that as well. So our plan is right now, you submit consent forms as you always do. You don't write them in any special way. We are drafting and inserting a key information section prior to the IRB review. This is mostly going to apply to full studies, so they're not going to be too applicable to you. We have an internal guideline about how to write key information. We have a template for key information. Then the IRB looks at the whole form, and we return that form with red line changes to the investigator. Why are we doing this? Because I feel it's really important that this key information be consistent from study to study and consistent within my office from panel to panel and member to member. I don't want a bunch of different varieties of key information out there. So this is how we're starting. This is the only way I can ensure we're not slowing down our process. You know, if we write key information and send that to the study team and say, hey, what do you think? Give us your feedback. That's going to be at least a week delay in terms of getting the study up and approved. Also, I can train my staff to do this. I can't train 1,000 investigators to do this in short order. Eventually, we will. I think eventually, when we've nailed down how these consent forms and they're very consistent, we can open it up to campus and say, this is what's going on. Go ahead and do it yourself if you want to. Like I said, I don't think it's going to apply to you because your consent forms are short. Our rule of thumb is if the consent form is 6 pages or less, it meets the key information requirement, and we're not going to do anything different with it. And that 6 pages does not include the HIPAA section. So it gives us some flexibility. I mentioned a new basic element of consent. This is something that has to be now in every consent form. And it's one of 2 statements. And it tries to convey the issue that we might remove identifiers from our data and do whatever we want to with it in the future research, which has always been true. We just never had to tell subjects about that up front. Now we do. So you either have to have a statement that explains identifiers might be removed from the data, and that after we do so, we could use this for future research studies without your consent. Or you can do the opposite, which is say that we're not going to do that. So we are never recommending that anybody put the second statement in any consent form that cuts you off. You cannot, there's no reason to do that. So in our template consent form, the consent that does not have the HIPAA authorization wording, we've inserted this paragraph, the first one. And we've been redlining that paragraph in any consent form that we've transitioned since July to make sure that it complies with the new rule as of Monday. But in the consent forms where that have our HIPAA language wording, we've considered that we already meet this requirement. That there's a lot of information in that HIPAA section, including sharing data from using it for future research. So no change in that context. The new additional elements of consent, there were 3. One is if you're collecting biospecimens, that you include a statement that this biospecimen may be used for profit and whether or not the subject will share in that commercial profit. We already do this. We've been doing this for years. It's in our HIPAA language. Again, any study that's obtaining a biospecimen has this wording, so we didn't have to implement a change here. If you plan to return clinically relevant research results to individual subjects, then the consent form needs to disclose this and explain how that might happen under what circumstances. Here too, we already do this. It's in our checklist internally. We ask you about whether you're going to be returning results. The answer, yes. So here too, we are already in compliance. And I think most IRBs were in compliance with these last 2 as well. Then if you're collecting biospecimens and you're going to do whole genome sequencing, that we'll talk about that here too. We've been in compliance for years. We just do this already. So this didn't really require a change. Internally, we made some changes to our reviewer checklist just to make the documentation a little clearer, but no change for us or for you, for that matter. This is just a slide to explain our process for going through and clarifying how where we needed to make changes and where we didn't. So do you do clinical trials? Okay. Yeah. So this will apply to you, and this is a weird new requirement. If you're doing a federally funded clinical trial, you are required to post 1 copy of your consent form to a public website after the study's close to enrollment, within 60 days of the last study visit, from the last subject. And that's as far as their guidance goes. You can post any version of the consent form that was approved during the life of the study and used on a particular subject. Do not post a consent form that was signed. You just need to post one that was actually used to enroll a subject. You only need to post one for the study. It is the responsibility of the lead site to do the posting. There are two sites. You can post it to clinicaltrials.gov or regulations.gov. Most of these will be posted to clinicaltrials.gov. Here is one area where we are drawing a line. We are only going to apply this to federally funded research. If it's not federally funded, we're not going to make people post consent forms. You will have already registered your trial, because if you're doing a federally funded clinical trial, that piece has long applied to you. So your study will already be on clinicaltrials.gov. That's the logical place to post your consent form when the time comes. I don't expect anybody's going to have to deal with this immediately because of the timeline. It's only going to apply to new studies, and it's going to be a while before those new studies have finished enrollment and they're within 60 days of the last visit.
I'm wondering about scenarios where you have waiver routine consent, specifically within a clinical trial, for example. Is there a vaccine?
No, I think you'd have to post that information sheet.
You just have to.
Yeah, because when we waive documentation, all we're doing is waiving the requirement that it be signed.
Right.
It's still a consent document that has all the required elements. If we waive consent, or if your research is exempted, then you wouldn't have to post anything. Yeah.
When you say new studies, you mean studies that are not officially approved as of today?
Or that have been officially approved starting Tuesday. Yeah. So when we transitioned studies, we didn't transition anything that would have triggered this requirement. So it really is just for new clinical trials going forward. If you are just a site in a multi-center trial, it doesn't apply to us. But if we have the grant, we're the lead site, it's our investigator that's doing investigator-initiated research, it does definitely apply to us. So the COMIRB piece to this is simple. We just add a sentence to our clinical trials paragraph and approval letters, just to let you know, hey, this is going to apply to you. Do you, for your clinical trials, do you put them in Encore?
No, not at this time.
Not at this time. Do you plan to or not? Yeah. For studies that are in Encore, the Clinical Research Support Center can do some monitoring on the institution's behalf of when that last visit has taken place and send out a reminder. It's time to post your consent form.
And for exempt studies, is there a need to post that?
Nope. It's exempt from that requirement.
And I should say, as far as clinical trials is concerned, studies that are happening in collaboration with Children's Hospital are like comply, not comply.
Yes, right.
So they'll be again.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where
this is impossible for COMIRB to track until it's too late. You know, we can get. There's not going to be, well, for a clinical trial, there must probably be a continuing review, but not necessarily. But you only have that 60-day window, so it's kind of tight. Regulations.gov is just a site where if you wanted to comment on a regulation, that's where you would do it. And it's not built for this, but that's an option. Like I said, most of these will probably go to clinicaltrials.gov. I have no idea what anybody is going to do with all these consent forms. So this is not one of the, this is sort of not a good change. We've talked about transitioning research. So we've documented and dated the dates that we transitioned, the study. If we've removed the expiration date, our approval letters document that it's now under the 2018 requirements. So institutionally, we're covered there. I mentioned that the definition, so these were the burden reducing provisions. We were required to implement the definition of research. As I mentioned, that really wasn't a change, effectively not a change. And I also mentioned we're going above and beyond. We're still looking at grant proposals. Let's see. OHRP does not require investigators to report to the IRB on an annual basis to provide an update. It doesn't require IRBs to do anything. So we are going to push out reminders on an annual basis for anything that we've transitioned. You don't have an expiration date, you will still get a reminder. That reminder will say, this is still active in our records. You're required to close it and let us know when you closed it so we can close it in our record, and here's a list of your ongoing responsibilities for conducting the research. You do not have to reply to that. It's just a one-way communication. You are still required to let us know when the study's closed. FDA has not changed their regulations, so they still require annual review. We can't transition FDA research. Department of Defense still hasn't updated, as far as I know, their internal policies and still require annual review. The VA just on January 8th updated their handbook and eliminated the requirement for continuing review. So now we hadn't been able to transition VA research these last 6 months, but now we can do that. You do any research with the VA?
No, we had some folks from the VA who were interested in this publication.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So
the VA made a lot of other changes, so they're pretty much in line with the new regulation. I was glad to see it. Talked about this. I'm not planning, if your sponsors ask, if you have a clinical trial that's under pre-2018 requirements, we're going to keep it there. We don't want to rewrite the consent form. We don't want to trigger a new requirement. You now have to post one of your consent forms. If it reaches the point where all that's left is long-term follow-up or data analysis only, then we'll make a decision about whether to transition it. And while we, OHRP hasn't issued guidance quite on yet, but it seems to be leaning towards, if it's a study that was pretty much all conducted under the pre-2018 requirements, they wouldn't expect you to post one of those old consent forms. So if you have an existing study and it hasn't transitioned yet, you still have an expiration date. You still have to submit a continuing review. The regulatory change doesn't apply to your study until we say it does. So you were approved under the pre-2018 requirements. You have to comply with those requirements until COMIRB transitions your study. Institutions have the option to transition like whole batches of studies. If they want to, we decided we're going to do this on a study-by-study basis. That's the only way we can ensure that we're transitioning the right studies and it's going to be in compliance with the new rules once we do that. As I mentioned, our approval letters will document which set of rules are applicable. Once we transition your study, we can't transition it back. It's a one-way street. Let's see. I think I've covered all of this. Reminders, we're looking at considering this a continuing review. If we have not transitioned your study and you submit an amendment, we're not going to consider transitioning your study at that point. It's at continuing review. Again, we remind you that the study is active, remind you what your responsibilities are. Again, you're still required to submit amendments if you underwent expedited review. If you are exempted, the only amendment you need to let us know about or anything that changes potentially moves it out of expedited. Unanticipated problems, non-compliance, you still have to report that. Study closures. You work with other institutions, so you should just be aware that not every IRB is implementing it the same way. This is one way IRBs are implementing it. Some IRBs still require continuing review. Some IRBs have come up with sort of an in-between kind of administrative review of some sort on an annual basis. So this is how we are handling it. Our policies and procedures are updated. If you care to look, I don't recommend it. We internally make sure we're not transitioning FDA or Department of Defense research. We made all the changes we needed to make in our electronic system. We were lucky. Most of the changes we needed to make, we could do ourselves, with our support, IT support. And in one case, the company made a change for us so that we could send out our notices based on an approval date instead of an expiration date. That all went very smoothly. Some IRBs have more trouble than others, depending on which electronic system they're using. Again, if it's a full board clinical trial, tell us at that last, we're definitely not going to transition anything potentially until it's at that data analysis stage. Well, quick question. So you have a minimal risk study. It's expedited review. It expires in May. Do you need to submit for continuing review? Yes. If you have an expiration date, you need to submit for continuing review. If you don't have an expiration date, your approval status will say approval not expiring. And there won't be an expiration date. That field will just be blank. So it should be pretty clear whether you have one or not. Your last approval letter indicates approval not expiring, so you've already transitioned. You're using a consent form. Do you need to revise it now? No, we already considered that. So we might have redlined in a new paragraph for you about future research, once the identifiers are stripped, but you shouldn't have to do anything. And if, I don't know, this will come up, but one reason IRBs didn't transition research is a misunderstanding that they would have to re-review all of their research now. And you would only need to do that if you transitioned the study without looking at it to make sure it was going to comply with the new rules coming in. So we considered that up front. Yeah, what questions do you have? Are there any other issues that you think of that might apply to the research you're doing? Always give us a call. You're welcome to come in. One of the changes we're implementing at COMIRB, we're doing a little very minor remodeling to give us a couple additional spaces to meet with investigators. So if you can come to office hours, that's great. But if you can't make office hours, contact us. And we are working on getting some meeting space in our suites so we can meet with you more frequently and more easily. I like meeting face to face, and then most of the staff do in the chair. It's easier to resolve problems more quickly.
Just curious about one thing. I'm just thinking about this typical studies that we do here that include the provider as the study subject. And the outcome is oftentimes medical records of the children that they treat. Right? And so typically we do get identifying information that records from the children. And then we do a lot of qualitative work with adults. And so that's the mix, right, that I mentioned before.
Right.
But it sounds like some of these changes might impact the way that we.
So that research could be, I think more of it will be exempt under. In that particular scenario you just described, I would say that's exempt in category 2 and 4. Normally, we just pick one, but that one, if both of sort of the arms of the study are exempt, we would just document both categories. Yeah.
Okay. So still stick with submitting all of those elements in one protocol.
Yeah. And do you do single IRB stuff?
We do have these studies, yes.
So single IRB, I'm not sure how this is going to play out, but if you have exempt research, we don't do IRB reliances. IRBs don't do reliances for exempt research. And now more research is going to be exempt, which means more research is going to be ineligible for reliance. I suspect that's not going to be a big deal, but it's something to be aware of. And the reason we don't do it for exempt is because it's exempt. You don't actually have an IRB approval upon which another institution to rely. So it would mean that each institution would still do their own exempt level review. And if it's exempt research, hopefully that's fast and quick and easy. But you might run into cases where not every institution is taking advantage of the new exempt categories. They might be going above and beyond. So change is going to proceed at different paces. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm thinking about the study that I actually asked you.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. It's good talking with you.
Thanks for coming.
Absolutely.
Very helpful.